Let's read the gentleman from Notre Dame. Quote, "For a child has been born to us, a son has been given to us. The emblems of sovereignty rest on his shoulders. His titles will be Marvelous Counselor, Hero Warrior, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace." Notice there are some differences there, but like Dr. Brown points out, and we already touched on this last week, so I'm not going to dwell on it too heavily right now. As we noted above, these translations are in keeping with some important rabbinic traditions that also understand the names to be those of the Messianic child. And the reason Dr. Brown is parked out on this aspect of that ancient rabbinic Judaism has some agreement that the names are referring to the Messianic child rather than to just an earthly king is because biblical Unitarian doesn't seem to even give a lot of weight to the thought that the names in the Christian Trinity version can even possibly refer to the Messianic person who's coming in the future, namely Yeshua. It's almost like they put all of their eggs into the basket of, no, this is just a human being. This can't be referring to any type of divine figure coming into the future. But even though they take sides with ancient rabbinic Judaism, which is strictly monotheistic, it seems like biblical Unitarian at times is unaware of the fact, or if they're not aware of it, at least they're not articulating this, they're unaware of the fact that even in rabbinic circles, a lot of messianic prophecies are seen to be or expected to be fulfilled by the coming Messiah, who, even though he is described as a man and by some rabbis, he's a very exalted figure by others. So, in other words, he's borderline a God-man in some other rabbinic descriptions. So let's read about some more of these. Let's keep reading Dr. Brown's objection to the strict monotheistic theology of rabbinic Judaism, which carries over or influences biblical Unitarianism. This is what Dr. Brown has to say in his book. Still, it is fair to ask how a prophecy delivered about a child to be born in the 8th century BCE can be applied to the Messiah. I mean, let me pause and interject. When you're reading your Bible and you're reading your Tanakh, your Old Testament, and you're encountering all of these prophecies about a coming exalted figure, and especially you're reading this within light of already having knowledge that David has been introduced into Israel's history. So we already know that David is the preeminent messianic king that was chosen by God to rule over Israel and to be the chosen righteous king at the highest level here on earth when it comes to human kings. David enjoys that spot. He's the first proper king of Israel, right after God rejected Saul. And then David is the one that's given the promises from God that God would expand David's dynasty to one day bring in the offspring of David, namely King Messiah. So that David, by the power of the Spirit, was able to confess in Psalm 2, around verse 7, "The Lord said unto my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet." And David recognized by the power of the Spirit that even though he was the king of Israel, there was coming one day and someone from his lineage who would be his very Lord. And this challenged ancient Judaism to rethink this idea of David is king, Messiah is king, but which one of them is greater? Because David called Messiah his Lord. So when we read through all the Old Testament prophecies, we have to remind ourselves that David is the king of Israel, and he is a representative of the earthly king that would rule. I mean, he's the model. He sets kind of the template for kings that follow after him in his line, in his lineage of righteous kings who would sit on his throne, right? Because of the promises that God gave him that his throne would never be empty. He would always have a messianic king to occupy his throne, someone from his lineage. And yet, when we start to read about these prophecies about these future kings, we begin to realize that some of the language cannot be completely fulfilled by an earthly king, especially with the language that starts to talk about the length of time that this king would occupy the throne. Obviously, David would be born, live, and then die. He can't occupy the throne forever. That's why, in a sense, he needs lineage so that he can carry on that seat, and they would sit in the seat for him. In other words, they would carry on the kingly rule of their father David. In other words, Solomon sat in his father's throne, etc., etc. Jesus did the same thing. In one sense, he sits in his father's throne, in the throne of his father David. But in a very real sense, it's always been Yeshua's throne, because David himself called this future king Lord. The Lord said unto my Lord, right? The Lord of me. Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. So David recognized, I'm the king, but there's another king who's coming after me, who's my offspring, but he's greater than me. How much of that he articulated by the Spirit, we don't know, but we do know that the New Testament does give us the clear, unambiguous explanation of what I just described. The New Testament writers understood that King Messiah sat in his father David's throne, and yet Jesus is greater than David, right? Because Jesus lived and died, but rose again and didn't suffer corruption. But David, by comparison, did. So how does this factor into Isaiah, and why am I even bringing it up? It's because the rabbis have a valid point when they're looking at the king being an earthly figure. That's the way the prophecy should be understood, right? There's no problem with that, to look for an earthly king, because God made those promises to David and to Israel that, yeah, I'm going to extend the Davidic lineage because that's my promise to David. It's not going to switch over to another lineage. David's not going to drop out. It's an eternal promise. So we must have an earthly king from the Davidic line sitting on the throne sooner or later, because that's the way the promises work. But at the same time, it is not entirely wrong for the Christians to come along and say, aha, these verses speak of someone who's greater than David, because of the time frames and because of the things that this earthly king is going to, or this Davidic king is going to accomplish. And the titles here are part of that extended understanding of this king is an earthly king, yes, but he's greater than an earthly king. And that's the proper way to take what the rabbis start with in defining this as an earthly king, but extend it on through to include King Messiah, who would come and occupy that seat one day. So I applaud Biblical Unitarian for recognizing the earthly king. Yes, we need that part of the prophecy. It's what we call the near-term part. It's the partial fulfillment. We need that. At the same time, I'm disappointed in you, Biblical Unitarian, for rejecting the far aspect, the far-term part, the far-reaching total fulfillment in King Jesus. And when I say I'm disappointed, I do know that you recognize that he is the King of Israel, and I don't misunderstand that that's what you're teaching. But you take some of those prophecies that can only be filled by someone who has the same powers as God, like bringing in everlasting righteousness to Israel, and being given this exalted position that all people recognize that you are this exalted ruler. Things that put you on equal footing with very God, that would be blasphemous if Jesus didn't have, in fact, deity in his DNA, right? If he wasn't full deity, if he wasn't fully divine. So, Biblical Unitarian, you guys need to rethink your theology there. So let's read Dr. Brown's notes, and then I'll just finish out tonight with Dr. Brown's notes. I spent most of my time talking about my own theology. Maybe what I'll do in post-production is I'll just attach, what do you call it? Those closed captions while I'm talking, so you can just read along while I'm talking. Here's what Dr. Brown has to say. The answer is simple. So we're talking about how can this prophecy be speaking about a child at the same time as applying to Messiah. It's pretty simple from his perspective. Based on widely accepted principles of messianic prophecy that explain why both Christian sources and a number of traditional sources also interpret the passage messianically. So what we have by Dr. Brown's research is, first, we must recognize that every prophecy regarding a Davidic king is a potential messianic prophecy. See other volumes that he's already put together. He's basically saying what I already just said. The glorious promises spoken at the birth of or coronation of a king in the line of David may have been partially fulfilled by a given ruler like David or Solomon or Hezekiah, but Dr. Brown concludes, like I just mentioned, they reached their complete goal, read here as fulfillment, in the Messiah, both the son of David and the one greater than David. And he's going to invite you to see below in section 422 as well as section 429 of these notes that we're reading. And both of those notes refer to Psalm 2 and Psalm 110 respectively. And I quoted part of one of those. So I think I quoted part of Psalm 2 there earlier, Psalm 2:7. Or not 2:7. Was I quoting the right psalm? I'll flash it in post just to make sure. Dr. Brown continues, second, as a well-educated conservative Jewish rabbi once emphasized to me, the prophet saw the Messiah coming on the immediate horizon of history. Right? Remember my little graphic that I will flash in post-production of prophetic telescoping. And Dr. Brown simply says, for details on this, see the appendix. Third, Dr. Brown reminds us that it is clear that the prophecy was not fulfilled by Hezekiah or any other Judean king, and therefore, by definition, by any other son of David. That is until the time of Yeshua. Remember, the prophecy has aspects about it that can only be filled by King Jesus, and that's why the prophecy has to include him. Otherwise, why do we need a Messiah who's fully human and only human like Jesus? We need a king who can have the eternal qualities that God himself enjoys. And I don't mean just a righteous king who gets resurrected and then lives forever like other believers would. No, we need a king who has more than those qualities. And we'll have to wait until we read more about them. I don't want to spoil it for you right now. Dr. Brown concludes in this little paragraph, therefore it is either a false prophecy or it must be a messianic prophecy, right? That's the simple truth of the matter. And let me read two more paragraphs here. Dr. Brown continues, we can get greater clarity on all these issues by considering Hezekiah as the possible subject of Isaiah's prophecy, remembering that it is the birth of the royal son that prompts great joy and celebration and guarantees the defeat of Judah's oppressive enemies. And then what we have is, Dr. Brown reminds us that beginning in Isaiah 9, the prophet declares, and look at this quote from Isaiah 9. Nevertheless, there will be no more gloom for those who were in distress. In the past, he humbled the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, but in the future, he will honor Galilee of the Gentiles by way of the sea along the Jordan. And this is just backing up into the passage of chapter 9, like I did a few weeks ago when we first introduced this topic of Isaiah 9:6. Let's keep reading from Isaiah 9. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light, and on those living in the land of the shadow of death, a light has dawned. This is Dr. Brown's quote from Isaiah 9. You have enlarged the nation and increased their joy. They rejoice before you as people rejoice at the harvest, as men rejoice when dividing the plunder. We're still reading Isaiah, for as in the days of Midian's defeat, you have shattered the yoke that burdens them, the bar across their shoulders, the rod of their oppressor. Every warrior's boot used in battle and every garment rolled in blood will be destined for burning, will be fuel for the fire. And now we get to our famous passage, which begins in the Hebrew with ki, for to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders. And he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. And then he continues by quoting Isaiah, of the increase of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. That's Isaiah 9, 1 through 7. And let me read just one more paragraph here, and then we'll call it quits. I'll park out right here, and we'll pick this up next week. On a certain level, Dr. Brown tells us, after reading what we just read, on a certain level, the meaning of these verses is clear. And what is it? great deliverance was about to come to the people of God because the glorious Son of David was born. The promised child was here. It was this royal son who would establish the worldwide dominion of the Lord, reigning on the throne of his father David. And we'll pause right there and pick this up next week. But that'll do it for a Trinitarian response to biblical Unitarianism.